Hi, I'm Moji Alawodeyal from the Feminist Buzzkills Live Pod, the only podcast that helps you navigate the news in this post-Roe anti-abortion hellscape. Each week, with co-host Liz Winstead, we dissect all the news from that sketchy intersection of abortion and misogyny with providers and activists working on the ground. The cherry on top is we have amazing comedy guests who help us laugh through the rage. Feminist Buzzkills Live drops Fridays wherever you pod. Listen and subscribe, because when BS is popping, we pop off.
I'm Brian Karam, and I've spent decades covering politics. Now I'm taking you behind the scenes, one interview at a time.
Join us as each week Brian confronts the issues that matter, posing the questions you wish you could ask. No filter, no agenda, just the truth.
We're not here for sound bites. We're here for substance. Join me, Brian Karam, every week as we cut through the noise and get straight to it. This is Just Ask the Question, where curiosity will lead us to the facts.
Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform, and remember, when you want answers, all you have to do is just ask the question.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. I'm recording this on Monday, February 2nd, and it really feels like the old joke that January is the month that feels like it's 7 months really was true. If you try to follow the news at all, either in the US or abroad, there's just been so much. Maduro, and then Greenland, and then Davos, and then, of course, American citizens acting as observers during immigration and customs enforcement actions in Minneapolis who were shot and killed by ICE agents. It's been a lot. But I also feel a little bit like things are changing. And one of the things that's changing is that more people in prominent positions are speaking out against what they feel like is overreach from the government. So as you probably know, in the streets of Minneapolis this month, federal agents of the very government whose leaders keep talking about law and order and accountability, shot and killed U.S. citizens. 37-year-old ICU nurse Alex Preddy was filming agents when he was pepper sprayed, wrestled to the ground, and fatally shot by Border Patrol officers. This came after another fatal shooting of an observer by an ICE agent earlier in the month that sparked massive protests. These were protests of thousands of people demanding accountability and change in how law enforcement is done. Entire communities poured into the streets in sub-zero temperatures, and they were chanting and demanding answers. But what you saw on cable news that night, and what most people heard about at first, wasn't just the shooting itself. It was politicians framing what it meant, arguing about whether the video was credible, whether the protests were justified, whether anyone should trust the media covering the protests at all. So let me tell you why I started with that story. When something like that happens, most of us don't sit down and consciously decide what it means. Instead, we absorb meaning as it's handed to us, a little bit at a time, through headlines, through repetition, through the way that the same few phrases keep showing up no matter where you turn. When you hear a consistent message, it eventually starts to feel familiar, and familiar things just feel safer. When something's repeated enough, even if it started out sounding extreme or shocking, your brain will quietly file it away as important, or maybe even true, or at least true enough to be seriously considered. And at the same time, other ways of talking about the same event just disappear. It's not because anyone banned them, but because they just never get repeated, or they don't get treated as something a serious person would say. And that is how boundaries move. They move because some ideas stay in circulation, and that can let other ideas starve. And this can become a real problem. Here's an example. In 2004, a man named Eric Garner was suffocated to death by a police officer who, in trying to arrest him, placed him in an illegal chokehold. Although the medical examiner said it was a homicide, a grand jury declined to indict the officer, and there were scores of rallies and protests over police brutality that highlighted Eric Garner. I want to read from the Wikipedia article on the incident. Garner, who was married to Esau Garner, was described by his friends as a neighborhood peacemaker and a generous, congenial person. At the time of his death, he was the father of 6 children, including a then 3-month-old child, and had 3 grandchildren. Garner had been arrested by the NYPD more than 30 times since 1980 on charges such as assault, resisting arrest, and grand larceny. According to an article in the New York Times, many of the arrests had been for selling unlicensed cigarettes. Now notice the competing frames here. Basically saint and sinner, family man and criminal. And when both of these frames show up, and officials, the ones news outlets turn to for commentary, go with the criminal side, the humanity angle will starve. There's a common tactic we've talked about on UnSpun before that goes by the acronym DARVO: deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. Here's an example. A man was killed by government agents, Alex Preddy, and the head of that government agency said this.
The victims are the Border Patrol agents. I'm not blaming the Border Patrol agents. The victim are the Border Patrol agents. The suspect put himself in that situation. The victims are the Border Patrol agents there.
When you hear something everywhere, it starts to feel like the center of the conversation. And when you never hear something at all, it starts to feel unreasonable to even bring it up. And that shifting range of what feels normal, reasonable, and politically possible, called the Overton window. And today, instead of talking about how politicians try to shove that window around, I want to talk about something we pay a lot less attention to. How sometimes the media moves it first, and politicians end up reacting to a conversation that's already been shaped for them. Because here's the thing about public opinion. Most of us don't wake up in the morning with a fully formed opinion on every political issue. We build those positions over time from bits and pieces, from what we hear discussed seriously and from what we never hear discussed. And that's where the window comes in, because you can think of it less like a window and more like a menu. At any given time, there's a short list of ideas that feel like the real options, things that sound responsible or adult or worth arguing over. And outside of that list are ideas that might exist, but they feel too extreme or too weird or too dangerous or just too embarrassing to say out loud. And most of the time, politicians didn't invent that menu, they read it. When you think about it, it makes sense, right? If an idea sounds unthinkable to most people, no serious politician is going to talk about it. If it sounds radical but discussable, you might hear it floated carefully, maybe as a question. And if it starts to sound sensible or popular, that's when it'll show up in speeches and social media posts and maybe eventually in policy. So the usual story goes like this. Public opinion changes, politicians notice, and policy follows. But that story skips over something important because public opinion doesn't just change, it gets shaped. And one of the most powerful shaping forces is media. When media keeps coming back to the same ideas, the same frames, the same questions, not once but day after day, those ideas start to feel central. Even inevitable. You don't have to agree with them for that to happen. You just have to hear them often enough. At the same time, ideas that fall outside of that repeated frame don't just lose arguments, they lose oxygen. They start to feel fringe or unserious. And that's how something moves from unthinkable to debatable without ever winning a debate. The process is slow enough that you don't usually notice it while it's happening. You notice it later when you catch yourself thinking, that used to sound really out there. For example, there was a time, recently, when the Affordable Care Act, the idea that the government might intervene in health insurance, seemed outlandish, like it would never happen. But now it's not only the law, but it was important enough to affect support for government funding bills even this year. So I think it's important to stop here and notice that this wouldn't be the same effect maybe on everyone in the audience. We can go back to what happened in Minnesota and look at the issue of the gun. Video evidence suggests that Alex Preddy had a gun on him. Video showed that the gun was not in his hand at the time he was killed and that he never made an effort to get it. I don't think people would deny that there's a lot of division in the U.S. right now, and one of those areas of division is around gun rights. You have Second Amendment absolutists who feel like the right to bear arms is sent from heaven and absolute. And you have a mishmash of supporters of gun rights for other reasons, like gun manufacturers who want to sell more guns and foreign governments that like to stoke division, and both of those groups give money to politicians to keep any gun restrictions off political discussion. But you also have people who think that there ought to be controls on gun ownership because they're so dangerous. But the gun rights people aided by the political payers, have kept political speech mostly in the absolute right camp. But after that shooting, you have started to see that frame get pushed a little bit. There are people who maybe had more liberal points of view who are speaking out about the fact that Freddie had a license to carry that gun. You saw people who might be previously opposed now advocating for Second Amendment rights to carry. And at the same time, you have the person in charge of an agency acting at the behest of a majority conservative government saying this.
As Christy said, you cannot bring a firearm loaded with multiple magazines to any sort of protest that you want. It's that simple. You don't have that right to break the law.
Public backlash to that from previously more moderate voices is causing a quiet recalibration. And that's kind of the window shifting, right? The media had something to do with that. Have a listen to this interview on a news show on MS Now, which is a cable network frequently labeled as being very liberal.
Brian, I'll begin with you. The president has not backed away from this assertion that you should not bring a gun to a protest.
Yeah, I mean, he's stated, as well as the FBI director, that folks should not bring firearms to protests. It's perfectly legal here in Minnesota to do so. Certainly, folks have to make their own risk assessment about whether or not, that's a wise thing to do, whether or not they feel safe doing so. But we just had a protest march last Friday in Minneapolis with nearly 50,000 people. And I'm sure folks were carrying firearms there, and we didn't have any violent incidents occur.
Since it's really about what feels acceptable to talk about, then the people who control attention, who decide what gets repeated, what gets framed as serious, what gets ignored, they have enormous power over where that window sits. And that brings us to the media. Because of the way the media can direct attention, it can move the window long before any politician takes a position at all. Because one of the easiest ways to move the window isn't to argue, it's to change the subject. Because people's attention is finite. You can really only worry about a few things at a time, and whatever gets the most coverage starts to feel like the most important thing happening, whether it actually is or not. There's a really striking example of this from Russia that helps make the mechanism visible. Researchers looked at more than a decade of articles from a major Russian newspaper and compared them to what was happening in the Russian economy at the time. And they noticed this pattern. When the Russian economy was doing well, coverage of the United States sounded relatively low and unremarkable. But when the economy took a hit, maybe the stock market fell or the GDP dropped, something else happened. Suddenly, there were a lot more stories about the U.S. Month over month, the researchers found that economic trouble at home was followed by a surge of coverage about an outside rival. And this wasn't subtle. The relationship was strong enough that researchers could actually predict increases in U.S. coverage based on economic declines the month before. And that framing mattered because the U.S. wasn't being discussed neutrally. It was framed as dangerous and violent and declining and hypocritical. American military action was described in extreme moral terms. American society portrayed as unstable, and Russian strength, especially military strength, was quietly emphasized by comparison. Now, the important point here isn't Russia bad, but it's just a good illustration of how this kind of thing works, because you're not telling people what to think, you're just telling them what to think about. And once attention gets redirected often enough, it starts to feel natural. Of course, this is what everyone's talking about. Of course, this is the central issue. Why wouldn't it be? And that's that window moving sideways. It's not changing policy yet, but it is changing the story. And once the story becomes set, everyone has to react to it, including politicians who don't operate in a vacuum. Which brings us to the part that usually gets left out. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we'll look at what happens when the media environment itself changes, not just the stories, but the entire ecosystem people are swimming in every day. Be right back. Welcome back. So, what happens when the media environment itself changes? Here's where the story usually gets told backwards. We tend to imagine politicians as the drivers, as the people who decide what matters, stake out positions, and then use the media to sell those positions to everyone else. And that does happen sometimes. But there's a lot of evidence suggesting that just as often politicians are responding to a media environment that's already shifted, trying to adapt what they believe voters are seeing, hearing, and caring about. A particularly compelling example of this comes from the late 1990s, when Fox News was first expanding across the United States. Fox News is typically rated as a very conservative news network for their cable channel. And Fox didn't show up everywhere at once. It was rolled out gradually, market by market, and it depended on local cable systems, which meant that some congressional districts suddenly had access to a new, explicitly conservative national news channel, while very similar other districts did not. Now, for researchers, that was a gift because it was a natural experiment. It meant that they could compare how members of Congress behaved as just the media environment around their voters changed without changing the voters themselves or the broader national political context. And here's what they found. As elections got closer, members of Congress representing districts with Fox News began to vote differently from members representing districts without it, even though they were voting on the exact same bills at the exact same time. Republican lawmakers in Fox News districts became more partisan as Election Day got closer. They supported Republican positions at higher rates than Republicans did in non-Fox News districts. And get this, at the same time, Democrats in Fox News districts began to moderate, breaking with their party more often as elections got closer. This wasn't happening months away from elections when voters weren't paying much attention. It was happening right when attention was the highest. And this is really important. No one had to persuade these politicians directly. There's no evidence they were watching Fox News themselves and being converted. What changed was their perception of what their constituents were hearing, what they were thinking about, what kinds of positions would feel safe or dangerous when the voters were most engaged. In other words, the media didn't just influence public opinion, it changed what mattered for elections officials. And to do that, it changed what was politically possible. It also helps to explain something we see all the time, politicians saying things that feel oddly reactive, as though they're chasing a conversation rather than leading it. You may have noticed this pattern around immigration, even if you never quite put your finger on it. There will be long stretches where it sits in the background of the news. It just doesn't get talked about much. And during those times, politicians tend to talk about it in familiar, almost automatic ways. They repeat the same talking points and they move on. And then, almost suddenly, something shifts in the media environment. Maybe there's an outside event, like a large group shows up at the border, or immigrants launch a noisy protest in a city that gets a lot of coverage. Or there's multiple videos of Border Patrol breaking car windows and throwing tear gas. There's more coverage, and the same clips keep coming up again until they seem like they're everywhere, and the same questions keep asking over and over until they start to feel unavoidable, like it's the only reasonable way to talk about the issue. Once the media is saturated, you can hear that change in how politicians respond. It's not a new policy or new information, but because the conversation itself has shifted, the old ways of talking about things just aren't enough anymore. So they start borrowing those same phrases they've been hearing, responding to questions that weren't being asked a few weeks earlier. Their tone shifts. Sometimes it becomes defensive, sometimes it's urgent, sometimes it just feels weirdly behind the curve, but politics itself starts to sound reactive. And it's not that these politicians suddenly discovered it's an issue. It's that the media has already decided this is what matters right now, and stepping outside of that frame is politically dangerous. So the politicians are reading the room. And there's another move that accelerates this process even further. Instead of adjusting to the media, some politicians try to disarm it entirely. Once you understand that politicians react to the media environment, the next move makes a lot more sense, because if the media helps define what feels acceptable, weakening the media's credibility is a way to loosen those boundaries even further. You don't have to prove a story is wrong, you just have to make people doubt the people telling it. Have a listen to Caroline Levitt as she is speaking to a reporter asking a question about Minnesota.
32 people died in ICE custody last year. 170 U.S. citizens were detained by ICE, and Renee Good was shot in the head and killed by an ICE agent. How does that equate to them doing everything correctly?
Why was Renee Good unfortunately and tragically killed?
Are you asking me my opinion? Because an ICE agent acted recklessly and killed her unjustifiably.
Oh, okay. So you're a biased reporter with a left-wing opinion.
What do you want me to do?
Yeah, because you're a left-wing hack. You're not a reporter. You're posing in this room as a journalist. And it's so clear by the premise of your question. And you and the people in the media who have such biases but fake like you're a journalist, you shouldn't even be sitting in that seat.
You can see that instead of answering the question, she's just attacking the person asking it. I think this is why fake news has become such a buzzword. It's simple, it's flexible, and it works even when the reporting itself is accurate. Researchers have tested this directly. They've done controlled experiments where people read ordinary news articles about politicians. Some of them will also read a short attack on the news source, a politician claiming the outlet was biased or unfair or working for the other side. And just reading that was enough. Even when the attack came after the article, people were more likely to walk away believing the source was biased. It didn't matter what party the attack came from, it still worked. The content of the article didn't change, it was just the trust in the messenger. If you believe a news organization is biased, you're less likely to believe they're reporting information that makes people you admire look bad. Instead, you'll say they're just biased, and over time you stop expecting the media as a whole to act fairly at all. And this can really change things. Because if no one is reporting fairly, or you can convince people of that, you're less accountable. Everything becomes debatable. Ideas that would have once been called out as false, misleading, or irresponsible don't need to win the argument anymore. They just need enough repetition, enough coverage, enough people saying, well, nobody really knows who to trust. We don't know if that's a real video or a fake video. So when you get people into that uncertainty, it's easier for them to think any idea is okay. And it's not because people have carefully reasoned their way to new beliefs, but because the guardrails that kept certain ideas out of bounds maybe are weaker. We can talk now about ending birthright citizenship, for example, or an urban liberal can argue in favor of gun rights. And this is how you get conversations that would have been unthinkable a decade ago treated as just another side in a debate. And there's one more step in the process. Once the view of what you can talk about changes, it becomes self-reinforcing. The pressure doesn't come from politicians or the media anymore. It starts coming from ordinary people, from colleagues, from friends, from the quiet sense of what you're supposed to say if you want to be taken seriously. Researchers have tried to model this process by simulating it. They built computer models where individuals belong to political parties, each party having its own informal range of acceptable opinions, its own internal perspective. People could believe whatever they wanted privately, but publicly they felt pressure to stay within their party's acceptable range. And over time, that pressure mattered. In those simulations, the parties enforced a narrow window, strict message discipline with talking points and strong social cues about what was and wasn't acceptable. The members of the simulated society didn't just change what they said out loud, their private beliefs slowly shifted too. Saying something enough or avoiding saying something often enough changes how you think about it. And what's even more unexpected is how this plays out depending on loyalty. When people don't feel strongly connected, people eventually drift away from strict parties because they don't like feeling constrained. They move toward groups with more tolerance that give them more room to speak. But when you're in an environment where loyalty is strong, where identity or culture or fear is keeping you in place, the strict party often wins. So if you find people seeing themselves mostly as members of a team, like a MAGA or the Resistance, they will toe the line. The group's unified message gets repeated, and over time that can pull not just its own members, but the entire conversation towards its position. And here's what happens. Disagreement doesn't go away, it just gets harder to express, and it becomes a spiral of silence. People learn what reactions they'll get, they learn what labels they're going to get, they learn what questions are safe and which ones will cost them social standing. And so moderate voices learn to keep their mouths shut. To say something like, states on the border might have bigger costs from migration, or vaccinated children help keep children who can't be vaccinated safe, feels like it's just not worth the dog pile, the doxing, the ratio. Staying inside the window feels easier than standing outside it, and this is how it becomes self-enforcing. And by the time policy catches up, when there's a law proposed or a practice becomes official, it feels less like a dramatic change and more like a formality. And so that brings us back to where we started. When something happens, whether it's a shooting or a protest or a crisis, and you feel that familiar rush to figure out what it means, it's worth slowing down just a bit, because the important shift isn't in the facts, it's in the framing. Pay attention to what's getting repeated over and over across outlets, across platforms, across your social media feed. Notice which questions are treated as reasonable to ask, and which ones never quite make it on the table. Asking questions like if ICE can shoot people legally carrying a weapon may spread and attract some unexpected supporters. And if there's one thing I hope you take from today, it's this. Political power doesn't just live in offices or elections or laws. It lives upstream in attention, in repetition, in trust, and in those quiet social pressures that tell us what kind of person says that kind of thing. Because by the time politicians are arguing about policy, the window has already moved. They don't lead the conversation as much as they respond to it, trying to survive inside boundaries that were set before they even came on the scene. So the next time a debate suddenly feels inevitable, or a position feels newly obvious, or a question feels strangely off limits, pause and ask yourself a few things. When did this become normal? Who's sharing this idea? And what stopped being talked about while this took its place? If you can learn to spot these shifts as they happen, you are already harder to manipulate, and that is how you stay unspun. Stay sharp, truth seekers, and I'll see you next time for Journal Club. Thanks for getting unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, Stay sharp, everyone.
Hi, I'm Frances Callier.
And I'm Angela V. Shelton.
And we're Frangela.
You know what you need in your life? The Final Word podcast.
Yes, you do.
That's right. It is the final word on all things political and pop cultural.
Where we make real news real funny.
Where we inspire you so you can #resist.
Subscribe and get a new episode of the Final Word podcast each week. It's the news we think you need to hear.
That's right. We think you need to hear it. Okay?
Yeah, it's what we say so.
That's right. And because all we do is give, every Thursday you can listen to our hysterical podcast, Idiot of the Week.
We round up the stupid because you know what? Somebody has to.
Okay. All we do is give.
It's Sunday morning, and that wonderfully relaxed feeling of a long, lazy day lingers in the air. If you want to make the moment last, may I suggest the perfect solution, the Martin Sheen Podcast. Join me, your host, Martin Sheen, for beautifully crafted 20-minute programs filled with never-before-heard stories of my life, along with personal reflections and poetry that inspires. The Martin Sheen Podcast is the perfect Sunday refresh, a chance to take a deep breath, relax, and know that the stress of Monday may be just around the corner, but not here, not now. So make this your weekly moment of calm as we explore faith, hope, love, and what it means to be human. And know this journey is ever unfolding as I invite you to see what's next with me, Martin Sheen. And thank you.